Captain David Johnson had been flying commercial planes for 22 years. At 48 years old, he was one of the most experienced pilots working for Skyline Airways. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his shoes polished to a shine, and his captain's hat sat just right on his head. Today was no different. David walked through Chicago's busy airport terminal, rolling his small suitcase behind him. He wasn't working today. Instead, he was heading home to Miami after attending a 3-day aviation safety conference. The conference had been intense, with long discussions about new flight procedures and safety protocols. He was tired but satisfied with what he'd learned. At the gate, David looked at his boarding pass. Seat 2A in first class. It was one of the perks of being a senior captain with the airline. After all these years of service, he'd earned the right to fly in comfort when he was off duty. He'd worked his way up from a young co-pilot fresh out of flight school to one of the airline's most trusted captains. It hadn't been easy. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, David had dreamed of becoming a pilot since he was 7 years old. He would spend hours at the local airport, watching planes take off and land. His parents, both teachers, had saved every penny to help him attend flight school. His father always told him, "Son, you can achieve anything if you work hard enough and never give up." And David had worked hard. Very hard. He'd studied while his friends went to parties. He'd taken extra shifts to pay for flight hours. He'd faced challenges that others didn't have to face, but he never let anything stop him. His determination paid off when Skyline Airways hired him as a first officer 15 years ago. The boarding announcement came over the loudspeaker. "We're now boarding first-class passengers for Flight 447 to Miami." David stood up, straightened his captain's jacket, and walked to the gate. His airline ID badge hung proudly from his uniform pocket, and his captain's stripes were clearly visible on his shoulders. As he boarded the plane, David nodded politely to the flight attendants. There were 4 of them working this flight. The head flight attendant was a woman in her 30s named Patricia. She had blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun and wore the standard airline uniform. She barely looked at David as he passed by. David found his seat and settled in. The first-class cabin was spacious and comfortable. He placed his carry-on bag in the overhead bin and sat down. The leather seat was soft, and he could already feel some of the tension from the conference leaving his shoulders. Other passengers began boarding. A businessman in an expensive suit took the seat across the aisle. Behind him, an elderly couple settled into their seats, the woman commenting on how nice everything looked. David pulled out his phone to text his wife Helen that he was on the plane and would be home by evening. "Flying home now. Can't wait to see you and the kids," he typed. Helen texted back quickly, "Safe flight, honey." "Dinner will be waiting," David smiled. After 25 years of marriage, Helen still worried about every flight he took, whether he was piloting or just riding as a passenger. Their 2 children, now teenagers, had grown up proud of their father's career. Their daughter Amy wanted to become a pilot too, inspired by her father's dedication to his job. As the plane filled up, David noticed Patricia and the other flight attendants preparing for takeoff. They were professional and efficient, going through their safety checks and preparing the cabin. David had worked with thousands of flight attendants over the years. Most were dedicated professionals who took pride in their work. They formed the team that kept passengers safe and comfortable. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Williams speaking from the flight deck." David recognized the voice. He'd flown with Captain Williams several times. They'd had many good conversations about flying and their families. "We're expecting a smooth flight to Miami today," Captain Williams continued. "Flight time will be approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." David relaxed as the plane pushed back from the gate. He'd been on thousands of flights, but he never got tired of the feeling of takeoff. There was something magical about leaving the ground and soaring through the clouds. It reminded him why he'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. The plane taxied to the runway. Through his window, David could see other planes lined up, waiting their turn. The airport was busy today, with flights coming and going every few minutes. He thought about how amazing it was that so many people could travel safely through the skies every day. As they waited for clearance to take off, David closed his eyes for a moment. The conference had been valuable, but he was ready to be home. He thought about his garden, which he'd been neglecting lately. Helen had been sending him pictures of the tomatoes that were almost ready to pick. He planned to spend his days off working in the yard and catching up with his family. The engines roared to life and the plane began its takeoff roll. David felt the familiar pressure as they accelerated down the runway. Within seconds they were airborne, climbing steadily into the afternoon sky. Chicago grew smaller below them until it disappeared beneath a layer of clouds. Once they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign turned off. David unbuckled his seatbelt and stretched his legs. The first-class cabin was quiet, with most passengers reading or working on their laptops. The businessman across the aisle was already on a phone call, speaking quietly about some important deal. Patricia began preparing for the meal service. David watched her organize the meals and beverages with practiced efficiency. He'd seen this routine countless times from the cockpit, but it was different being a passenger. He appreciated the hard work that went into making each flight comfortable for travelers. The flight was smooth, just as Captain Williams had predicted. David looked out the window at the landscape passing below. Fields and towns spread out like a patchwork quilt. He never tired of this view. Even after all these years of flying, he still found it peaceful to watch the world go by from 35,000 feet. David pulled out a magazine and began reading an article about new aircraft technology. The aviation industry was constantly evolving, and he made it a point to stay current with all the latest developments. It was part of what made him such a respected captain. He never stopped learning. As the plane flew south toward Miami, David felt grateful for his career and his life. He'd worked hard to get where he was, and he'd earned the respect of his colleagues and the trust of thousands of passengers. Tomorrow he'd be back in the cockpit, but today he was just another passenger heading home to his family. Little did David know that this routine flight was about to become anything but routine. The peaceful afternoon was about to take a turn that would change everything and test everything he believed about fairness and respect. The meal service began about an hour into the flight. David looked up from his magazine as Patricia wheeled the meal cart down the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin. The smell of the hot meals filled the air, and David's stomach rumbled softly. He hadn't eaten much at the conference that morning, just a quick cup of coffee and a muffin. Patricia started serving meals to the passengers in the front rows. David watched as she placed elegant trays in front of each traveler. The first-class meal service was always nice, with real silverware and cloth napkins. It was a far cry from the simple snack served in economy class. The businessman across the aisle received his meal first. He thanked Patricia politely and immediately began eating while continuing his phone conversation. The elderly couple behind David received their meals next, with the woman commenting on how lovely everything looked. David waited patiently for his turn. He'd been looking forward to a good meal after the long morning at the conference. Patricia was now serving the row in front of him. She moved efficiently, placing each meal tray carefully and asking passengers about their beverage preferences. When Patricia reached David's row, something strange happened. She looked at him, then at his seat number, then back at him again. Her expression changed from professional courtesy to something else. Something that made David feel uncomfortable. "Excuse me," Patricia said, her voice slightly different than it had been with the other passengers. "Can I see your boarding pass?" David was surprised by the request. He'd already shown his boarding pass when he boarded the plane. But he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the boarding pass, handing it to Patricia with a polite smile. Patricia examined the boarding pass carefully, turning it over and looking at it from different angles. She seemed to be studying every detail. David noticed that other passengers were starting to look in their direction. "This seat is 2A, Patricia said, stating the obvious. "Yes, that's correct," David replied calmly. "That's my assigned seat." Patricia looked at David's uniform, taking in his captain's stripes and his airline ID badge, but instead of recognizing him as a fellow Skyline Airways employee, her expression grew more suspicious. "How did you get a first-class ticket?" she asked, her voice now carrying a tone that David had never heard from a flight attendant before. David was taken aback by the question. In all his years of flying, no one had ever questioned his right to sit in first. "Airways," David explained patiently, pointing to his ID badge. "I'm traveling on company business, returning from a conference in Chicago." Patricia barely glanced at his ID badge. Anyone can get a uniform, she said dismissively. I need to see some real identification. David felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard stories from other pilots about situations like this, but he'd never experienced it himself. He reached for his wallet and pulled out his driver's license and his Skyline Airways employee ID card. Patricia took the IDs but seemed unimpressed. She studied them with the same suspicious expression she'd had when looking at his boarding pass. These could be fake, she said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The businessman across the aisle looked up from his meal, his phone call forgotten. The elderly couple behind David stopped eating and turned to watch what was happening. Other passengers in the first-class cabin began to take notice of the unusual situation. David felt his face grow warm with embarrassment, but he maintained his composure. Years of dealing with difficult situations in the cockpit had taught him to stay calm under pressure. Ma'am, I can assure you that my identification is real, David said quietly, hoping to resolve the situation without creating a scene. I've been a captain with this airline for 7 years. Perhaps you could check with the flight deck. Captain Williams and I have flown together many times. Patricia shook her head. I'm not bothering the flight deck with this, she said. First-class meals are for paying first-class passengers only. Before David could respond, Patricia reached for his meal tray, which she had been about to serve him. She lifted it from the cart and turned away. Wait, David said, his voice still calm but with a note of disbelief. You're not going to serve me my meal? Like I said, Patricia replied without looking back. First-class meals are for paying customers. David sat in stunned silence as Patricia moved on to serve the passenger behind him, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. The passenger behind him, a middle-aged woman in a business suit, received her meal without any questions or demands for identification. The businessman across the aisle was staring openly now. He'd stopped eating entirely and was watching the situation with obvious concern. The elderly woman behind David leaned forward and whispered something to her husband, who shook his head in apparent disapproval. David tried to process what had just happened. In all his years of flying, both as a pilot and as a passenger, he had never been treated this way. He looked down at his uniform, at his captain's stripes, at his ID badge hanging clearly visible on his chest. Everything about him identified him as exactly who he said he was. Another flight attendant, a young man named Kevin, approached David's row. David hoped that Kevin might be more reasonable than Patricia. Is there a problem here? Kevin asked. David started to explain. But before he could say more than a few words, Patricia called out from across the aisle. Kevin, this passenger is claiming to be an airline employee, but his story doesn't add up, she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. He says he's a captain, but I've never seen him before. Kevin looked at David's uniform and ID badge, but like Patricia, he seemed skeptical rather than convinced. Sir, I'm going to need you to show me some identification, Kevin said, even though David's IDs were still in Patricia's hand. David felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. He was being treated like a criminal in front of a cabin full of passengers, despite wearing the uniform of the very airline they were all flying on. My identification is right there, David said, pointing to Patricia. I'm Captain David Johnson. I've been with Skyline Airways for over 20 years. Kevin retrieved David's IDs from Patricia and looked at them briefly. But instead of apologizing for the misunderstanding, he seemed to share Patricia's suspicions. These IDs could be fake, Kevin said, echoing Patricia's earlier comment. And this uniform could have been bought online. David felt his heart pounding in his chest. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he couldn't understand why. He'd done nothing wrong. He was sitting in his assigned seat, wearing his legitimate uniform and carrying valid identification. Gentlemen, said a voice from across the aisle. The businessman had put down his phone and was looking directly at the flight attendants. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Patricia and Kevin turned to look at the businessman, clearly annoyed by his interference. Sir, this doesn't concern you, Patricia said firmly. Actually, I think it does concern all of us, the businessman replied. This gentleman is clearly a pilot with your airline. His uniform, his identification, everything checks out. Why are you treating him this way? Patricia's face flushed red. We have procedures to follow, she said defensively. We can't just take someone's word that they are who they say they are. But you took my word, the businessman pointed out. You didn't ask me for identification. You didn't question whether I belonged in first class, the elderly woman behind David spoke up. He's right, she said to her husband, but loud enough for everyone to hear. This isn't right. David appreciated the support from his fellow passengers, but he was deeply troubled by what was happening. He'd dedicated his entire adult life to aviation. He'd earned his position through hard work, skill, and determination. He'd safely transported hundreds of thousands of passengers over the years. And now he was being treated like he didn't belong on the very airline where he worked. Patricia and Kevin exchanged glances. Instead of reconsidering their position, they seemed to dig in deeper. We're going to need to contact airport security when we land, Patricia announced. This passenger may have boarded the aircraft fraudulently. David's heart sank. The situation had gone from embarrassing to potentially serious. He thought about his family, his career, his reputation, all because he'd tried to fly home from a work conference in his assigned first-class seat. As the flight continued toward Miami, David sat quietly in his seat, still without his meal, still being viewed with suspicion by the flight attendants. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some supportive, others curious about what was really going on. David had faced many challenges in his career. He'd handled emergency landings, severe weather, and mechanical problems. But this was different. This was personal, and he had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. David sat quietly in his seat, still processing what had just happened. He'd been denied his meal and was being treated like a fraud by his own airline's employees. Other passengers were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, shifting in their seats and whispering among themselves. The businessman across the aisle, who had introduced himself earlier as Richard Thompson, couldn't seem to focus on his work anymore. He kept glancing over at David, then at the flight attendants, with a look of growing concern on his face. "This is ridiculous," Richard said, loud enough for Patricia and Kevin to hear. "I fly this route every month for business, and I've seen this man in the cockpit before. He's definitely a pilot with this airline." Patricia turned around sharply. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to mind your own business. We have this situation under control. Do you?" Richard challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're harassing one of your own employees for no good reason." Behind David, the elderly couple, Harold and Betty Martinez, were having their own quiet conversation. Betty leaned forward and tapped David gently on the shoulder. "Excuse me, dear," she said in a kind voice. "My husband and I fly quite a bit, and we've definitely seen you before. You were the captain on our flight from Miami to Denver last Christmas. You came back to the cabin to check on passengers during that rough weather we hit." David turned around and smiled gratefully at Betty. "Thank you for remembering," he said. "That was quite a bumpy flight." Harold nodded in agreement. "You handled it beautifully, Captain. Made everyone feel safe when we were all pretty scared." Kevin overheard the conversation and approached the elderly couple with a stern expression. "Ma'am, anyone can claim to remember someone. That doesn't prove anything." Betty looked shocked. "Young man, I may be 78 years old, but my memory is just fine. This gentleman was definitely our pilot." Patricia joined Kevin, and both flight attendants now stood in the aisle, blocking David's row. The situation was becoming more confrontational by the minute. "Look," Patricia said, addressing the passengers who had spoken up. "We appreciate your concern, but we have strict security protocols to follow. This person is making claims that we simply cannot verify." "What claims?" asked a new voice. A woman in her 40s, sitting 2 rows behind David, had been quietly observing everything. Her name was Linda Chen, and she was a frequent traveler who worked in corporate security. "He's not claiming to be the president. He's saying he's a pilot for the airline we're currently flying on. His uniform looks authentic, his ID badge is clearly visible, and multiple passengers have recognized him." Linda pulled out her phone. "In fact, let me see if I can help clear this up." She began typing on her phone screen. Patricia noticed what Linda was doing. "Ma'am, what are you doing with your phone?" "I'm looking up Skyline Airways pilot directory," Linda replied calmly. "It's publicly available information for security purposes. Let's see. David Johnson, captain based in Miami, hired in 2002. Here's his photo from the company website." Linda held up her phone, showing a professional photo of David in his pilot's uniform. The resemblance was unmistakable. Kevin barely glanced at the phone. "Anyone can create a fake website or fake photos," he said dismissively. Linda stared at him in disbelief. Are you suggesting that someone created an elaborate fake website just to get a free first-class meal? Do you realize how absurd that sounds? The tension was escalating, and other passengers throughout the first-class cabin were now paying attention. Some had stopped eating their meals to watch the unfolding drama. A young woman in the last row of first class, Rachel Foster, had been quietly recording parts of the interaction on her phone. She was a social media manager for a large company and had seen enough workplace discrimination to recognize it when she saw it. "Excuse me?" Rachel said, standing up. "I've been filming this interaction, and I think everyone needs to take a step back and think about what's really happening here." Patricia spun around to face Rachel. "Ma'am, you cannot film on this aircraft without permission." "Actually, I can," Rachel replied confidently. "There's no law against filming in public spaces, and this is clearly a matter of public interest." "You're discriminating against this man for reasons that have nothing to do with airline security." Kevin moved toward Rachel. "I'm going to have to ask you to delete that recording." "No," Rachel said firmly. "I will not delete it. This gentleman is being treated unfairly, and people need to see what's happening." Richard Thompson stood up in support of Rachel. "She's absolutely right. This whole situation is wrong, and if more people don't speak up, it's going to get worse." More passengers began voicing their support for David. A businessman 2 rows up turned around and said, "I've flown with Captain Johnson before too. He's one of the best pilots I've encountered." A woman traveling with her teenage daughter added, "This is embarrassing for your airline. You're treating your own employee like a criminal." But Patricia and Kevin seemed determined to stick to their position, no matter what the passengers said. If anything, the criticism from the passengers seemed to make them more defensive. "Everyone needs to return to their seats," Patricia announced loudly. "We are dealing with a potential security situation, and passenger interference is not helping." "Security situation?" Harold Martinez said incredulously. "The only security situation here is the one you've created by refusing to believe your own employee's identification." Linda Chen was still working on her phone. "I've just sent a message to Skyline Airways customer service through their app," she announced. "I've explained the situation and asked them to verify Captain Johnson's identity directly." Patricia looked alarmed. "You had no right to contact the airline." "I had every right," Linda replied. "As a paying customer, I'm witnessing what appears to be discrimination by your employees, and the airline needs to know about it." Rachel was also working on her phone. "I've just posted the video to social media," she said. "My followers need to see how Skyline Airways treats its employees." Kevin looked panicked. "You can't post that video." "Delete it immediately." "Too late," Rachel said. "It's already been shared 50 times. David watched all of this unfold with a mixture of gratitude and concern. He was touched by the support of his fellow passengers, but he was worried about how far the situation was escalating. He'd seen workplace conflicts before, and he knew that sometimes they could spin out of control quickly. "Please," David said, standing up for the first time since the confrontation began. "Everyone, I appreciate your support more than you know, but let's try to keep this calm. We're all stuck on this plane together for another hour." Patricia pointed at David. "Sit down immediately. You are not authorized to be standing in the aisle." "I'm not authorized?" David repeated, his composure finally beginning to crack. "Ma'am, I'm a captain with this airline. I'm authorized to be anywhere on any Skyline Airways aircraft." "Not according to us," Kevin said. "And we're the flight crew in charge of this cabin." The absurdity of the situation was becoming clear to everyone except Patricia and Kevin. Here was a man in a perfect uniform, with valid identification, recognized by multiple passengers, with his information publicly available on the airline's website, and yet 2 flight attendants continued to insist he was some sort of imposter. Betty Martinez shook her head sadly. "In all my years of flying, I've never seen anything like this. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Richard Thompson was on his phone now, too. "I'm calling the airline's complaint hotline," he announced. "This needs to be reported to management immediately." Linda's phone buzzed. "Skyline Airways customer service just responded to my message," she said excitedly. "They've confirmed Captain Johnson's identity and they're contacting the flight immediately." Patricia and Kevin exchanged nervous glances. The support for David from the passengers was overwhelming, and now the airline itself was getting involved. But instead of backing down, Patricia doubled down on her position. "Until we receive official word from the company, This passenger will continue to be treated as unverified. Rachel looked up from her phone with a satisfied smile. Well, the video has now been shared over 500 times, and the comments are, let's just say they're not very supportive of your position. As the plane continued its flight toward Miami, the first-class cabin had become a battleground between passengers supporting David and flight attendants who refused to admit their mistake. David sat quietly, wondering how a simple flight home had turned into such a public spectacle. He thought about his wife and children, who would probably hear about this before he even landed. He thought about his colleagues at the airline, and how embarrassed they must be by the actions of Patricia and Kevin. Most of all, he thought about the years he'd spent building his reputation as a professional pilot, and how 2 flight attendants were putting all of that at risk. The situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone could have imagined, and David had a feeling that the worst was still to come. The phone in the galley area began ringing insistently. Patricia looked at it with growing anxiety, clearly aware that the call was likely related to the situation she had created. She let it ring several times before reluctantly answering. "Flight 447, this is Patricia," she said, her voice noticeably less confident than it had been earlier. David couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but he could see Patricia's face growing pale as she listened. Her expression changed from defensive to worried to outright alarmed in the span of just a few seconds. "Yes, sir," Patricia said into the phone. "I understand. No, sir, I didn't verify with operations. Yes, he's still in the cabin. No, sir, we haven't served him his meal." The passengers in first class watched Patricia's side of the conversation with growing interest. It was becoming clear that whoever was on the other end of that phone call was not pleased with what they were hearing. Linda Chen leaned over to Richard Thompson. "Sounds like someone from the airline finally got through to them," she whispered. Patricia hung up the phone and stood frozen for a moment, staring at nothing. Kevin approached her, and they had a hushed conversation that lasted several minutes. Both flight attendants kept glancing nervously at David and the passengers who had supported him. Meanwhile, Rachel Foster's social media post was gaining serious traction. Her phone was buzzing constantly with notifications, comments, and shares. The video of the confrontation was spreading rapidly across multiple platforms. "This is incredible," Rachel said to Linda. "The video has been viewed over 10,000 times in the last 20 minutes. People are furious about what they're seeing." She showed her phone screen to Linda, who read some of the comments aloud in a quiet voice. "This is disgusting discrimination. Skyline Airways should be ashamed. Fire these flight attendants immediately. That pilot deserves better treatment." Harold Martinez tapped David on the shoulder again. "Captain, I think the tide is turning in your favor. Those flight attendants look like they just got in serious trouble." David nodded gratefully, but he was trying to remain calm and professional despite everything that had happened. He knew that his response to this situation would be scrutinized just as much as the flight attendants' behavior. The galley phone rang again. This time, Kevin answered it. His conversation was even more concerning for the flight crew, with lots of "yes, sir" and "I understand, sir" responses. When he hung up, he looked visibly shaken. Patricia and Kevin huddled together near the galley, having what appeared to be a very serious discussion. Other flight attendants working in economy class came forward to see what was happening. David could see them whispering among themselves and looking in his direction. Suddenly, there was movement from the front of the aircraft. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Williams himself stepped into the first-class cabin. His presence immediately commanded attention from everyone on board. Captain Williams was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He wore his uniform with the same pride that David did, and his captain's stripes were clearly visible. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had been flying commercial aircraft for over 30 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Williams announced, "I apologize for the disturbance in the cabin. I need to address a situation that has come to my attention." Every passenger in first class turned to listen. The cabin, which had been buzzing with conversation and tension, became completely silent. Captain Williams walked directly to David's row and stopped in the aisle. "Captain Johnson," he said formally, "I want to personally apologize for the treatment you have received from members of my cabin crew today." David stood up to greet his colleague. "Captain Williams, thank you for coming back here." "David, I've just received calls from both operations and customer service about this situation. Captain Williams continued, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. I want everyone in this cabin to know that Captain David Johnson is not only a legitimate employee of Skyline Airways, but he is one of our most respected and experienced pilots. The passengers who had supported David exchanged satisfied looks. Richard Thompson nodded approvingly, while Betty Martinez smiled with vindication. Captain Williams continued, Captain Johnson has over 20 years of experience with commercial aviation. He has an impeccable safety record, and he has been recognized multiple times for his professionalism and dedication to passenger safety. He was returning from a mandatory safety conference in Chicago, traveling on official company business. Patricia and Kevin stood frozen near the galley, their faces red with embarrassment. The magnitude of their mistake was becoming clear to everyone on board. Furthermore, Captain Williams said, his voice growing more stern, the behavior exhibited by certain members of my cabin crew today is completely unacceptable and does not reflect the values or standards of Skyline Airways. He turned to address Patricia and Kevin directly. The discrimination shown toward Captain Johnson is inexcusable. You have embarrassed not only yourselves but this entire airline. Linda Chen couldn't help but smile. I think Captain Johnson is about to get his meal, she whispered to Richard. Captain Williams turned back to the passengers. On behalf of Skyline Airways, I want to apologize to all of you for witnessing this unprofessional behavior. This is not how we treat our employees, and it is certainly not how we want our passengers to see us operate. He then addressed David directly. David, I hope you will accept the airline's sincere apology. Your meal will be served immediately, and I will personally ensure that this incident is thoroughly investigated. David shook Captain Williams' hand. Thank you, Tom. I appreciate you coming back here to clear this up. It shouldn't have been necessary, Captain Williams replied. This should never have happened in the first place. The captain then made an announcement that surprised everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that this incident has been recorded and reported to Skyline Airways management. The behavior of the cabin crew members involved will be subject to a full disciplinary review. Patricia finally found her voice. Captain Williams, we were just following security protocols. Captain Williams cut her off with a stern look. Patricia, there are no security protocols that justify refusing to recognize a uniformed employee with proper identification who has been vouched for by multiple passengers and verified by the company itself. Kevin tried to speak up as well. Sir, we thought... That's the problem, Captain Williams interrupted. You didn't think. You made assumptions based on bias rather than facts, and you created a situation that has now embarrassed this entire airline in front of thousands of people on social media. Rachel Foster looked up from her phone. Actually, Captain Williams, it's been viewed by over 50,000 people now. Captain Williams closed his eyes briefly, clearly understanding the full scope of the public relations disaster that had been created. Thank you for that information, ma'am. He turned back to Patricia and Kevin. You two will remain at your positions for the remainder of this flight, but you will not interact with passengers unless absolutely necessary. When we land in Miami, you will report directly to management. The other passengers in first class were watching this unfold with fascination. It wasn't often that they got to see such immediate accountability for poor behavior. Betty Martinez leaned forward to speak to Captain Williams. Captain, I want you to know that Captain Johnson has always been professional and courteous in all our interactions with him. This incident does not reflect on him at all. Several other passengers nodded in agreement. Richard Thompson added, Captain Johnson handled this situation with more grace than I would have shown. Captain Williams smiled at David. That doesn't surprise me. David has always been a consummate professional. Linda Chen held up her phone. Captain Williams, I documented this entire incident in my complaint to customer service. I want to make sure Captain Johnson receives proper recognition for how he handled this difficult situation. Thank you, Captain Williams replied. I can assure you that will be taken into account. As Captain Williams prepared to return to the cockpit, he made one final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing in Miami in approximately 45 minutes. Thank you for your patience during this unfortunate incident. He paused and looked directly at David. David, after we land, please don't leave the airport until we can speak privately. There are going to be some people from management who want to talk with you about how we can make this right. As Captain Williams walked back toward the cockpit, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin completely changed. Patricia and Kevin retreated to the galley area, clearly dreading what awaited them in Miami. The passengers were buzzing with excitement about witnessing such immediate justice. David finally received his meal, though he found it difficult to eat after everything that had happened. His mind was racing with thoughts about what this incident would mean for his career, his family, and the airline industry as a whole. Rachel continued monitoring her social media posts. "Captain Johnson, you should know that public opinion is overwhelmingly in your support. People are calling for serious consequences for those flight attendants." David nodded appreciatively, but remained focused on maintaining his professionalism. He knew that how he handled the aftermath of this situation would be just as important as how he had handled the incident itself. As the plane began its descent toward Miami, David looked out the window at the familiar landscape below. He was finally heading home, but he knew that this flight had changed everything. The story was far from over. As Flight 447 touched down at Miami International Airport, David felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The landing was smooth, but he knew the real turbulence was just beginning. Through his window, he could see several official vehicles waiting near the gate, which was unusual for a routine arrival. The passengers remained in their seats as the plane taxied to the gate. Captain Williams' voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Miami. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying Skyline Airways." As soon as the plane stopped at the gate, David noticed several people in business suits boarding the aircraft. They moved quickly and purposefully toward the first-class cabin. Behind them, airport security personnel also entered the plane. Rachel Foster was still monitoring her social media accounts.
"Captain Johnson, this story has exploded online."
It's trending on multiple platforms and major news outlets are starting to pick it up. She showed David her phone screen, where he could see headlines like, "Airline Captain Discriminated," "Against by Own Company Staff and Skyline," "Airways Flight Attendants Refuse to Serve Black Pilot." The story had clearly grown far beyond what anyone had anticipated. A woman in an expensive business suit approached David's row. She was obviously a high-level executive with the airline, and her expression was serious but apologetic. "Captain Johnson, I'm Victoria Harrison, Vice President of Operations for Skyline Airways," she said, extending her hand. "I want to personally apologize for what happened to you today." David shook her hand and stood to greet her properly. "Ms. Harrison, thank you for coming." "Captain Johnson, this incident is completely unacceptable and does not represent our company's values," Ms. Harrison continued. "We take discrimination very seriously, and I want to assure you that there will be immediate consequences for the employees involved." Behind Ms. Harrison, David could see Patricia and Kevin being escorted off the plane by security personnel. They were not in handcuffs, but they were clearly being removed from their positions immediately. Other flight attendants who had been working the flight were also being questioned by airline officials. Richard Thompson, who was preparing to leave the plane, stopped to speak with Ms. Harrison. "Ma'am, I want you to know that Captain Johnson handled this situation with incredible professionalism. He remained calm and dignified despite being treated terribly by your employees." "Thank you for that feedback, sir," Ms. Harrison replied. "We will definitely take that into consideration." Betty and Harold Martinez also stopped to speak before leaving. "We've flown with Captain Johnson before," Betty said. "He's always been wonderful. This whole situation was ridiculous from the start." Harold nodded in agreement. "Your flight attendants should have recognized one of their own pilots. This was completely unnecessary." Linda Chen approached with her phone in hand. "Ms. Harrison, I documented this entire incident in my complaint to customer service, and I also have email confirmations of Captain Johnson's identity verification. I'd be happy to share all of that information with your investigation." "That would be very helpful," Ms. Harrison said. "Please send everything to our corporate office. We want to have a complete record of what happened." As the passengers filed off the plane, many of them stopped to offer David their support or to share their contact information in case he needed witnesses for any formal proceedings. The show of solidarity from complete strangers was overwhelming. Rachel was the last passenger to leave, and she had important information to share. "Captain Johnson, the video has now been viewed by over 200,000 people. There are calls for boycotts of the airline unless they take strong action. People are really angry about what they saw. Ms. Harrison looked concerned about the public relations implications. We're monitoring the social media response closely, she said. This is exactly the kind of situation we want to address quickly and decisively. After all the passengers had left, Ms. Harrison led David to a private area of the airport where several other airline executives were waiting. There was the regional director, the head of human resources, and the company's legal counsel. Captain Johnson, the regional director, began. We've conducted a preliminary investigation based on the passenger reports and the social media evidence. What happened to you today was discrimination, plain and simple, and it will not be tolerated. The head of human resources stepped forward. The 4 cabin crew members involved in this incident have been suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Based on what we've already learned, we expect that suspensions will become terminations. David was surprised. 4 crew members? I thought it was just Patricia and Kevin who were involved. 2 other flight attendants were present during the incident and failed to intervene or speak up on your behalf, the legal counsel explained. They witnessed discrimination and did nothing to stop it, which violates our company policies just as much as the original discriminatory behavior. Ms. Harrison continued, Captain Johnson, we want to make this right. First, we're implementing immediate additional training for all cabin crew on recognizing airline employees and on our anti-discrimination policies. Second, the regional director added, we're creating a new protocol for situations like this. If there's ever any question about an employee's identity, there will be a clear procedure for verification that doesn't involve questioning the employee's right to be on the aircraft. The head of human resources pulled out a folder. We're also offering you additional compensation for the embarrassment and distress you experienced today. We know that money can't undo what happened, but we want to acknowledge the harm that was done. David appreciated the gestures, but he was thinking about bigger issues. I'm grateful for your response, he said, but I'm more concerned about making sure this doesn't happen to other employees in the future. That's exactly the right attitude, Ms. Harrison said. We'd like you to be part of developing our new policies and training programs. Your experience and perspective would be invaluable in preventing similar incidents. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading rapidly beyond social media. Local news stations in both Chicago and Miami had picked up the story. National news outlets were beginning to report on it as well. The airline's stock price had already begun to decline as investors worried about the public relations impact. Captain Williams joined the group after completing his post-flight duties. David, I want you to know that the entire pilot corps is behind you on this. What happened today was wrong, and we're all glad to see the company taking it seriously. Thanks, Tom, David replied. I appreciate your support, and I especially appreciate you coming back to the cabin to set the record straight. The legal counsel addressed the next steps. Captain Johnson, there will likely be media requests for interviews. We want to support whatever decision you make about speaking publicly, but we also want to make sure you have all the resources you need to protect your interests. David thought about his family, who were probably watching the news coverage and worrying about him. I need to get home to my wife and children first. They're probably scared and confused about all of this attention. Ms. Harrison nodded understandingly. Of course. Take all the time you need. We'll handle the media response for now, but when you're ready, we'd welcome the opportunity to have you speak about your experience and our commitment to change. As the meeting concluded, David finally felt ready to go home. The executives provided him with their direct contact information and assured him that he would be kept informed of every step in the investigation and disciplinary process. Walking through the airport, David was surprised to be recognized by several travelers who had seen the story online. Most offered words of support, and a few asked to take photos with him. He was gracious but eager to get home to his family. When David finally arrived home, his wife Helen and their 2 children were waiting for him. They had indeed seen the news coverage and social media posts. Dad, you're famous, his teenage son exclaimed, showing him news articles on his tablet. Are you okay, honey? Helen asked, giving him a long hug. I can't believe they treated you that way. I'm fine, David assured his family, and the airline is taking it very seriously. Changes are going to be made. Over the next few days, the story continued to gain national attention. The 4 flight attendants were officially terminated after the investigation, confirmed the discrimination that had occurred. Skyline Airways announced new policies and training programs, with David serving as a consultant in their development. The airline also made a significant donation to aviation diversity programs in David's name, and they created a new scholarship fund for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation. David received thousands of messages of support from fellow pilots, flight attendants, and travelers from around the world. The incident, while painful, had sparked important conversations about discrimination in the workplace and the need for companies to stand up for their employees. 6 months later, David was invited to speak at the annual Aviation Professionals Conference about his experience and the changes that had resulted from it. He spoke about the importance of treating all employees with respect and dignity, regardless of their background. "What happened to me on that flight was wrong," David told the audience. "But the response from my airline and from the public showed me that most people believe in fairness and equality. Sometimes it takes a difficult situation to create positive change." The incident had indeed created positive change, not just at Skyline Airways but throughout the aviation industry. Other airlines reviewed and updated their own policies. The story became a case study in business schools about corporate responsibility and crisis management. For David, the experience reinforced his love for aviation and his pride in being a pilot. He continued flying for Skyline Airways, where he was eventually promoted to chief pilot. He used his position to mentor young pilots from all backgrounds and to ensure that the culture of respect and inclusion continued to grow. The flight that started as a simple trip home had become a catalyst for industry-wide change. And David Johnson, who had handled discrimination with grace and dignity, had become a symbol of the progress that was still needed and the positive change that was possible when people stood up for what was right.